Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Lengel, and with me today is our Northeast Regional Editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, in Pennsylvania, we are still in a budget impasse. And while we talk about the budget, we're talking about whether or not the rainy day fund can be used to make up for budget deficits. So first of all, can you tell us what the rainy day fund is?
It's actually, the name is kind of a misnomer if you ask me, because when I think of saving money for a rainy day, to me, and perhaps I just misunderstand the metaphor, but to me, that's not necessarily meaning save it for an emergency. I always thought save it for when you're bored. But I could be completely wrong. Either way, it is essentially the state's emergency savings account. There's about $7 billion in there. Now, this account, it has a special name. I forget what it is, but emergency savings account is what it is. And there is particular state law around how we are supposed to use it. It's supposed to be tapped in the event of unexpected revenue shortfalls. So, for example, during the Great Recession, 15 years ago, it was tapped then because revenues plummeted. We weren't expecting it. And so everyone said, yes, let's use this because I think there was like 755 million taken from it at that time. So that would be a good example of one reason to use it. There's also economic downturns that are sustained in nature that, again, we weren't expecting. Truly, it's meant to stabilize government operations in the event of massive revenue declines that we don't want to make up for necessarily by huge tax hikes. So the other thing that is important to note about this is that our fund has grown significantly in the last several years. We had a lot of the ways that good government groups like to measure the health of these funds, if you will, is by trying to determine how long the government, like how many days the government could sustain itself with the money in the account. Back in 2021, we had like enough money to last 2.5 days. It was pretty abysmal. We were in the bottom 5 of states for the amount in our fund. Thanks to COVID and some of those stimulus money, we've built it up to $7 billion in the last couple of years. Now, it wasn't all COVID. There was other infusions in there that helped bring it to that level. But now we have almost 2 months worth of operating money that could help us in the event of some sort of catastrophic economic issue that would make it hard for us or almost impossible for us to sustain government. So that's the basics of it.
Well, it's interesting because, you've mentioned, like, here are some of the factors for how it grew. And, if you're following state government, you know that Josh Shapiro takes credit for the surplus we have in the rainy day fund. Treasurer Stacy Garrity, who may be Josh Shapiro's opponent in the next gubernatorial election, also takes credit for that savings of money, right? And then, when you look at House or Senate Republicans, they're always talking about this huge deficit that we have to make up for. So I think that was really helpful in making that distinct from the budget that we have. So how do the two interact? Like, all that extra money really can't impact our day-to-day workings in the government?
So it's interesting because I think this is a legal question, one that we haven't answered yet because no one has challenged how we use the rainy day fund when we need to for the budget. And that, I think, is something that has been thrown out into the ether that could happen if the legislature approves a budget that does that. And what I mean by thrown out to the ether, the Commonwealth Foundation, they're a conservative think tank. They're very focused on fiscal policy that is very conservative, and they really care very much about what's in the rainy day fund. They're big advocates for saving that for the intention of the law. And they are generally aligned with Republicans, particularly in the Senate, on a lot of policy issues. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And there is, again, they are correct. There is state law that dictates how you can use it. They have written a letter to Treasurer Stacy Garrity and the leaders in the House and the Senate imploring them to remember what the law is, so that with this budget deficit we are facing, they don't just dip into that fund to balance it, because their argument is we are not in a time of emergency. Our economic position has been well known. There wasn't anything unexpected that came up. The only thing that has happened is that they still haven't passed a budget, right? And we're not going to get into all of the minutia of why that happened, but right now we're at a stalemate because of politics, as is, generally what happens. So their argument is that that is not sufficient reason to use the money, and they have to figure out another way to balance the budget. And what's important to note about this too is that for as long as I can remember, there has been impending fiscal cliff. There's been a deficit that we have to make up for in some way, shape, or form. It's usually been in the multi-billion-dollar range. The concern over that deficit is that Republicans, and there is evidence or solid proof that this would eventually have to happen if we didn't change our spending patterns, is that their fear is that we would have to raise taxes significantly in order to make up for that. And Republicans are very anti-tax increase. And sometimes, a lot of the times, Democrats find that really limiting in a way that slows our economic growth, because we are unable to fund safety net programs and other important programs that Pennsylvanians may actually want and need. So that's kind of always been the big tension there. And so then you get into more of the, which I said I wasn't going to get into, but here we go. You get into the budget discussion. And so now you have a court mandate to change the way we fund public education. That means in a lot of ways more money. For Republicans, that also means reforming the ways we divide up the money so that it's going more fairly to places. Again, there's argument about how to do that. Democrats have a funding formula that they want to do. Republicans don't like it. Back and forth all the time. There's other programs and issues that come up that, again, become at the center of this. We have a budget deficit argument, and that we're going to make it worse if we just spend willy-nilly. And then if we spend down our rainy day fund, what happens when that, natural disaster comes and we need it, right? So that is the question. What seems to be of difference here is that it sounds like there could be a legal challenge should they use that money to ultimately balance the budget this year and pay for spending basically pay for new spending that's going to be recurring with a savings fund. That we all have surely taken for our savings account to cover a bill here and there. Well, this is taking from our savings account to cover billions of dollars in spending. So that's really where the tension is. And I spoke to the treasurer's office about, what they thought about this letter. They agreed with the sentiment that there are legal safeguards on how we use the money. They didn't say that they would pursue any legal action if the rainy day fund is tapped. The other important thing that I didn't mention here is that in addition to the economic conditions that have to be met, there also has to be a 2/3 vote by the legislature in order to do this. And that's actually never happened. Even back in the Great Recession when we did use it, it was not by a 2/3 vote. So there are several challenges to the way that the process has been done in the past and the way that it could be used here in order to get a budget deal, because the legislature is great for bending their own rules and making things work that technically are outside of the bounds of what they agreed to. They do what they want. They get the votes together, they find a way to make it technically workable, and that's what they do. And so there is a strong possibility that something like that could happen with the rainy day fund, although perhaps it's a big reason why we're not seeing any movement on this budget besides all the other issues that we talked about. So that is kind of in a nutshell where we're at. We don't know. We don't have a budget deal in sight. We have no idea if this is going to be an issue or not, just based on past deals. Republicans have made a really big show of making sure that every time we add more money to that pot of money, they lead their press releases with it. That's a very big victory for them. So as you can imagine, dipping into that would be an ideological and symbolic blow for them in an already really difficult budget season.
Well, we'll certainly continue to follow that. And, there are all of the obvious reasons that we hope for progress on the budget, and just the hope that we'll have something else to talk about in this state soon. So hopefully we'll see it soon. Thank you so much for joining us, Kristen. You can follow this and everything else at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.